Hey, I'm Steve. Welcome to the podcast stuff with Steve, and I'm here with Jon Green again. And Jon, we're going to talk about worship today, but to do that, I thought I would read a popular verse from the Bible in Romans 12. Then I want to ask you a question. Romans 12, 1, 2.
Okay.
Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. And I want to talk about that word worship.
Okay.
For a little bit. So when you read that passage or you see the word worship in the Bible, what kind of images are you naturally drawn to, or what kind of things are you thinking about?
I think that there are two. One that Paul kind of references in this passage, which is the image of sacrificing something on an altar, right? And so the whole image of the Old Testament, like sacrificial system, and we talk about Jesus as a sacrificial lamb, right? The Lamb of God. And here Paul is making that analogy that our bodies, our lives themselves are supposed to be on the altar to God, right? So that would be one. And then the other one is like another word in the New Testament that's often translated as worship is the image of like meeting a monarch. So like I always think of like when people meet the Queen of England, and they have to like bow, or they have to like curtsy or kneel and then kiss her hand. That's also worship, right? And so what does that mean for? What do you think of when you think of worship in that passage? Sometimes I'm thinking of Sunday morning worship. I'm thinking of that. Sunday morning.
And then I'm also thinking, well, I need to be worshiping God throughout the day, and have, as you were saying, well, that's kind of the word adoration, or I'm having some emotions and feelings toward God, the creator of the universe. And so when I think of worship, I think giving somebody their what they're due. And I don't mean like monetarily, but if I'm meeting the Queen of England, I'm gonna be super respectful and realize their position, I guess, and those kinds of things.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and in that verse in 12:1, like Paul, I think it's interesting that you said like emotions, because both of those like pictures of sacrifice and sort of like bowing down don't have anything to do with emotion. Right? It's just a recognition of who God is. So like in that verse in 12:1, Paul sort of says that the only thing that's the thing that's reasonable when you think of God's mercy in your life is for you to offer your body. So he appeals to reason, right? Or the idea that this is the thing that makes sense. And he makes that same argument in other places, like in 1 Corinthians, where he talks about Christ purchasing your body, and so you shouldn't use it for sin, right? Or other places through some of his letters, and this idea that because of God's grace and because of the sacrifice of Christ and your redemption, the rational and reasonable thing to do, not the emotional thing to do, is that you give Jesus control of your body, or you offer it as a sacrifice, right?
Yeah. So one of the reasons I mentioned emotions there, and is that first off, I remember reading a book a long time ago by J.I. Packer, theologian, saying we need to love God with our emotions, and a lot of people don't do that. And secondly, when I think about the Old Testament sacrifices, I think about the kid whose lamb they raised is all of a sudden on that altar getting slaughtered.
Right.
And there's an emotional reaction to that.
Yes.
And also that our bodies is more than just us physically, it also includes our emotions.
So do you think when Packer wrote that book that at the time that do you think that in evangelical America church, like Grace Community Fellowship, that people are not emotional enough, or that they're overly emotional about their faith?
No, I don't think they're emotional enough.
Yeah.
That's what I would say. And I don't mean emotional enough like, I guess we'd have to define that. Does that mean crying like I'm emotional?
Right. Yeah.
No, I think it means like take the husband-wife relationship. So I love my wife, and if it's just there's an emotional element to that, right?
Right.
There should be.
Right. But I think when we talk about worship in the church, I think some people, so to use that same marriage analogy, I think some people have this idea that if you're not like treating every day like it's the first day that you met and you're not head over heels infatuated and in love with your wife, well, then you might not be in love anymore. Does that make sense? And then we apply that to worshiping God, or like if people show up to church or they're not like just on fire all the time, well, then they might not love God enough.
Yeah, I
right?
guess I'm thinking in a way that, I'm a fairly analytical person,
right,
and probably somewhat stoic in my emotions.
Right.
But then I recognize in myself that that may not be a good thing in relating to God, because I'm not letting myself, I'm loving God with my physical actions, not my emotional being.
Yes.
I want to make sure that it's all of me, just not my physical actions, but my emotions too.
Yes.
Yeah. And it doesn't mean it's the same dynamics. When I first got saved, I was so excited, couldn't read the Bible enough.
Right.
And over time, that kind of changed, just like any relationship.
Sure.
But it still needs to be, somewhat of my emotions need to be involved. And I think a lot of people in the Western world are like, oh, we can't, they're a little hands off on that area.
Yeah.
Would you?
No, I see what you, no, I would agree with that. I think a lot of people, I would say that people compartmentalize, and so they don't give their heart to God, right? And they don't make their heart and their emotions part of that offer your body as like your being or yourself, right? They don't offer their whole self on as a living sacrifice in that way. But on the flip side of that coin is that people then on the flip side of that, they also make this thing, if I feel ecstatic emotions, well, then that must be God's presence, and I'm really worshiping right now, right? You see what I mean?
And that's not necessarily true at all.
And that's not necessarily true at all. Exactly.
So I'm on the other spectrum of that, where I'm steady Eddie emotionally, right? So I'm in no danger of being
You're not going to be dancing up and down the aisles next week.
No, and you wouldn't want to. Mary would be embarrassed by my dancing, right? She says I can't even clap correctly. So.
Well, I think
but there are other people that associate, hey, I need to have all this emotion or I don't love God. That's what you're saying.
Or I'm not worshiping.
Right.
I'm not worshiping if there's not this like display of emotion, right? I think that's very prevalent in the modern church. Whereas if you go to the history of the church, that isn't necessarily the case. There isn't this idea that worshiping God is predicated by display of emotion, even though that's certainly part of it.
What about our intellects? I don't know if I'm drawing.
That's great that you say that, because like in Romans 12, Paul says this is your reasonable service, or your reasonable act of worship, right? To offer your bodies, and then he qualifies that by saying, don't be conformed, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Right? So the way that you think. Worship is the thing that changes the way that you think, right? And so that word in the Greek, the proskuneo, this idea of bowing down or kneeling or curtsying to someone, right? Like this, because they are in authority. So this would be the image of the meeting a monarch, right? That. I heard somebody say recently, like, Christianity is monarchy, and if you don't think that, then you're not reading the Bible right.
There's a king
right?
and a kingdom.
There's a king and a kingdom. This is not a democracy, and it's not a republic. It's a monarchy, and in monarchies, when you meet the king, you bow. Period. There's no, you don't not do that, right?
And we know that everyone's going to bow.
Right.
At some point, right?
Right.
Philippians chapter 2.
Exactly. And but this idea, this act of bowing, like is a recognition of my submission to that person's authority. And then here, like this idea that act of submission to that person's authority is the thing that changes my mind. can transform me.
I like that you brought up this proskuneo word, being bow down or falling down in front of.
Yeah.
So I was thinking that we have examples of that, plenty of examples in the Bible, like Isaiah bowing down, feeling unworthy.
Right.
Many people in the Old Testament falling
but
prostrate.
do we have modern analogs to that?
Oh, that's a good question.
As Christians, as evangelical Protestants, do we have analogs to that? Maybe not.
Yeah.
Maybe not good ones.
Sure.
Maybe there are. If I was to say, going to church and participating in worship means that you are on your knees and you bow your face to the floor, what image comes to your mind when you say that? When I say that?
That's weird.
That's weird. Yeah.
Okay,
so years ago, I remember like when here at Grace, I showed a picture of a Muslim mosque and made the statement like, this is more like what the Bible describes as worship than what we do.
Yeah.
And in terms of a visual like analog to like what is it that we're talking about when we talk about worship in the Bible, and this idea of kneeling and bowing down and all of that sort of stuff that we don't really do. In fact, churches that do it, like the Catholic Church or the Lutherans, churches that practice the liturgy,
have, kneeling benches,
right? But they get made fun of, right? Like I just heard somebody say the other day, like the Catholics still practice stand up, sit down, fight, right? And like this idea that we make fun of that, even though that's a scriptural thing, so.
Yeah, sure. And on the other hand, the Jewish synagogues always had benches and seats. So there was lots of sitting in chairs. So it wasn't all just kneeling as well.
Right.
And I was reflecting this whole kneeling thing because in John, it says that, the Gospel of John, when Jesus is approached by Judas Iscariot and the troops, something happens and every soldier falls down prostrate to the ground, right?
Yeah.
So why did that happen? And the only answer I come up with, the glory of God somehow was revealed, and it threw them. That was their response at that time.
Like Isaiah.
Yeah. So we have this kind of. We do have these examples of kneeling in the New Testament as well.
Yes, absolutely.
Falling down. So when you think about worship on. Well, one of the things I think about when it comes to worship in this whole living sacrifice, that we're alive, not dead. That's a paradox there to say that. Kind of most sacrifices are dead; they get sacrificed.
Yeah,
and they would have had a Jewish Old Testament view. That's what would have popped into their head, right? There's no longer a dead lamb on the altar. I'm a living sacrifice, and I'm living for God. So and then we have Sunday morning. And then we have Monday morning. Sunday morning, I might be singing in church, listening to the word, whatever. But then Monday morning, how does, my worship looks different?
Yeah, I think people have, I think contemporary Christian culture has so pigeonholed the word worship into meaning our Sunday services or the music style that we listen. Like worship music is an actual style in commercial music now. Like you just had Maverick City play it at the Grammys, like, so the idea that I think that complicates people's understanding of what worship means, and they lose sight of the fact that maybe what we do on Sunday is not worship. I mean, it is, but it's not the entirety of it, right?
So how do we break people away from that pigeonhole? Maybe there's no good answer to this, because many people think that, hey, singing on Sunday morning for 20 minutes, that's worship. Other things are not worship. How do we help people see a bigger picture than that?
Or if people didn't clap on Sunday morning in church, or they didn't have displays of emotion, then it wasn't worship. Or,
I guess what I'm saying is, how do we get people beyond the worship service itself? Like you just said.
That's a great question.
Yeah, I mean, we can teach on it, maybe we talk about it, but I've heard you say many times to people, hey, whatever you do today, that is your act of worship. If you're helping people, that's your act of worship.
Yeah,
if
yeah.
you're serving people, that's your act of worship.
Right. So
I would
like,
think there are many acts of worship that we can do.
yeah. So like here in that passage in Romans 12, but then like at other points, Paul says things like everything you do, is for God. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so we try to, here at Grace on Sunday mornings, we try to focus with our Sunday service teams that work in helping make the services run on sort of pointing out that it's not just the music team that is leading worship on Sunday morning, right?
Okay.
It's everybody. Everything we do as a church, as a collective body of believers, can be an act of worship, right? And so years ago, Harold Best at Wheaton wrote a good book about worship where he talks about this like sort of the distinction between the sacred and the secular, and that sometimes we think certain things are worshipful and other things are not, and that maybe that's true sometimes, but maybe it's not true other times, right? Yeah. But the idea that the worship team on stage, quote unquote, my air fingers if you're just listening,
okay,
like they're the worship leaders, and but so is the person who's like the parking lot attendant, and because that thing that you're doing is an expression of service to God, which you can do as an act of worship, as an expression in view of God's mercy, and offering yourself as a living sacrifice, right?
Yeah.
So,
hey, I want to ask you, because you grew up in a pastor's home. Your dad was a Southern Baptist pastor.
Yeah.
And I've heard you, and I'm sure that shaped your view of music and worship and many of the things we're talking about.
Sure.
But I've heard you say many times that your dad would be washing the dishes and singing hymns.
Yes. At night.
At night.
Yeah.
So what's up with that? How did things like that people singing on their own, that's probably a good thing, you would say.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to draw at that.
Yeah, I think so. Like you asked a minute ago, like Sunday morning versus Monday morning, and I think part of that like pigeonholing of worship is also this idea that I think a lot of people maybe don't struggle with the desire to worship God, but the like knowing what that means, right? And so for me, like in one sense, we have a wealth of assistance in 2022, because I can turn on Spotify and like listen to Christian music for hours and hours and hours, right? But in another sense, that like in the same way that can be a help, it can also be a crutch, because then I depend on that thing, to have it. But like for my dad, I mean, he didn't just sing hymns. Like, he was also singing Hank Williams sometimes, and stuff like that. But, but just the idea of like the natural expression of our lives being one of thankfulness and this idea of service to God. And I think that idea of compartmentalization is a big part of that, because I think a lot of people go, well, this is my work life, and then this is my home life, and this is my faith, and this is like, and they try to separate those things out instead of seeing themselves, like we were talking about earlier, their whole life and their whole being and all of their emotions is wrapped up in this idea of living sacrifice, right? And so you are a holistic person, and everything you do is you. Like when you go to work, you're the one at work, and when you're at home with your kids, you're the one at home with your kids, and when you're reading your Bible, that's you. And so none of those things, there aren't like 6 separate yous, that it's all the same person doing those things. And so making each and every one of those parts of your life an offering to God is, I think, what Paul is getting at with this conversation about worship.
Yeah, great. I know we could talk hours about worship.
We could talk a long time.
Yeah, a long time. But as we kind of wrap it up here, hey, you got a new hat on.
Yeah.
You got the New York Yankees hat on.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
hey, how are the Royals doing?
Oh, man, that was painful. They're 9-17 or something. I looked yesterday, and And
we should do a podcast sometime on like whether if you're not a baseball fan, can you actually be effective in ministry?
I think that's a good one to talk about. Somebody on our staff, they don't know the difference between a touchdown and a home run.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, so, I'm getting frowned at over here in the corner. But okay.
All right.
Well,
thanks
Jon,
for having me.
Yeah, Jon, thanks for talking today about worship. Hey, I'm Steve, and hope you enjoyed the podcast today. Grace and peace be with you.